every year.
All right, welcome everyone. Thank you all for tuning in to our webinar with Andrew Feinstein, 7 Myths That Sustain the Global Arms Trade. My name is Danica. I'm a national organizer with CODEPINK, and I work on our Call to Disarm campaign, where we're trying to get members of Congress to pledge to stop taking money from weapons companies. So far, we've had 13 members of Congress sign on to this pledge. Just yesterday, Representative Ilhan Omar signed the pledge to refuse any campaign contributions from the top 5 weapons companies, which is huge. Just to show everyone the efficacy of it, every Congress member who signed our pledge vote to cut the Pentagon budget by 10%, which is awesome. And they vote consistently better on arms sales and war issues, that kind of thing. Before we get started, this webinar will try to unpack the myths we're told about national security. What do we sacrifice for the national security state? What actually makes us safe? What harm does the global arms trade cause to our environment and the integrity of our politics? First, I'm going to show a trailer to the documentary Shadow World. So I'm going to do that really quick. And feel free again to introduce yourselves in the chat. We'll have time at the end for questions. Can everyone see the video okay? Is it on the screen?
Okay. The thing about politicians is that they're very much like prostitutes, but only more expensive.
The heads of government are the salespeople in chief of their country's large arms contractors.
For the last 50 years at least, policy has been made based on the assumption of greed. And it's ruined the world.
This very phrase, war on terror, it's nonsense. It's like saying a war on war. You're slipping into this possibility of kind of perpetual war.
The national security state not only seeks a perpetual state of war, it will even go to all ends to create that.
They make the mafia look like a bunch of schoolboys.
It destroys diplomacy. It destroys the will to diplomacy, and it destroys the skill for diplomacy.
Bombs, they're like food. Munitions, that's got, sell by that. You gotta get rid of it.
Blair came to South Africa to lobby that BAE, the British weapons manufacturer, won the biggest contract, $10 billion. Scarce public resources on this weaponry that we didn't need. And this is the template around the world.
BAE channeled international covert payments all over the world to the local politicians.
Seems to be a very expensive way of organising bribe payment. Might as well cut out the military equipment and just hand out the money.
It's the disease of permanent war that destroys the Middle East, not Islamic fundamentalism.
Companies are not only sort of part of the government, but they're effectively above the law.
It's okay to kill from a distance without a warrant, without a trial, without a jury, and the execution takes place off screen.
Once you start a war, you open a kind of Pandora's box. You don't control it, it controls you. And it propels you in directions you never thought you'd go.
That is Shadow World. Highly recommend watching it. Now I will introduce our speaker. Andrew Feinstein is the author of The Shadow World and After the Party, which is a detailed account of his time spent within the ANC and the cover-up involving the arms deal scandal. Feinstein is the founding director of Shadow World Investigations, formerly Corruption Watch, an NGO that undertakes path-breaking investigations into cases of grand corruption, corporate maleficence, and militarism, predominantly but not exclusively in the global arms trade. And with that, I will pass it over to Andrew to speak to us, and we'll leave time at the end for questions. So if you have questions pop up, please just put them in the Q&A section or in the chat.
Thanks so much, Danaka. It's great to be here. Thank you for organizing this. It's always an especial pleasure for me to do events with CODEPINK. as some of you who might have seen the Shadow World film, which first came out in 2015, I think, no, 2016, and was shown on PBS 2017, I think. My memory's not that good. You'll know that Medea appears in the film, suggesting to Barack Obama that he probably wasn't quite as pure as he projected himself when it came to issues of national security, and I'm sure we'll talk about that a little bit more. It's also important to mention that Medea and Jodie financially helped make the film possible, because as you can imagine, raising money for a feature documentary on the global arms trade when you're based in the UK, your producers are in the US, is not easy to do. So I've been working with CODEPINK for many, many years and believe the organization to be one of the stellar activist movements around issues of militarism, the arms trade, and all of its consequences. Just looking at people who've introduced themselves, it's great to see people from many parts of the US, and also to see a wonderful comrade from Estonia has also joined us. For those of you who are not in the US, please forgive me. I am going to focus a lot of my arguments on the US because one can't really talk about the global arms trade without focusing on the US, which accounts for 40% of all the weapons produced in the world. So that's obviously a really important starting point. In terms of the film, it was based on a book that I wrote that was first published in late 2011, this one, called The Shadow World: Inside the Global Arms Trade. It's not actually as intimidating as it looks. About a third of that is footnotes, because in the age in which we live, I happen to believe that it is extremely important that every time you make a claim about the role of governments, the role of our militaries, that they perform in the world, it's extremely important to show the documentary evidence, or to allow those you're communicating with to understand the sourcing that those statements are based on. Because it is far too easy for people today, unfortunately, starting with our political leaders, obviously, to pretty much say what they want to say. And its relation to actual fact and truth is often extremely tenuous. And I think for those of us who are campaigning for a better world in the very broadest sense of the term, we have a responsibility to be fact-based, to be truthful, to stand in opposition to the various forms of power that we need to hold to account and who we ultimately need to overthrow. Because the reality is, when we address the global arms trade and the militarism that informs it, there are really two ways to address it. The one, which is simple verbally, but incredibly difficult politically, is simply to say, we will not deal with the nature of our militarism unless we deal with the structure and functioning of our political and economic systems, because they are so incredibly closely intertwined and tied together. And I think those of us who regard ourselves as progressive activists and campaigners have a responsibility to operate at that structural level, if you will. But at the same time, and in parallel, we have to engage with the existing structures of power, both political and economic, and the relationship between the two, to address the daily consequences of this militarism. We cannot sit by waiting for a time when our politics change fundamentally, while tens of thousands of innocent civilians are being killed by the Saudi and UAE-led coalition in Yemen, using our weapons, our advisors. So we have to work at these two different levels. And perhaps towards the end of the conversation, we can talk a bit more about what that campaigning and activism looks like. I know many of you from some of the names I've seen here are engaged in some incredible campaigning work. And we can talk a bit more about that if it's of interest to you. The second thing to note is the title of this webinar comes from the title of this book, Indefensible: 7 Myths That Sustain the Global Arms Trade. It was put together by ourselves and a group based out of Boston called the World Peace Foundation. And the World Peace Foundation has been incredibly generous. Before the pandemic, it used to bring together about 20 of us from around the world who work on the arms trade in what we describe as a systemic way. In other words, with cognizance of its structural and systemic features. And would bring us together twice a year to really be able to provide solidarity, support to each other, to catch up on what we were each working on. And Jody and Medea have participated in some of those discussions. And it's from that group that this book really transpired. A colleague of mine based here in London, also a South African who speaks strangely like I do, called Paul Holden, edited this volume. And a lot of the examples and facts that I refer to will come from this book. And I'm very glad to tell you, because there's nothing worse than someone who claims to be a campaigner or an activist who's then touting some sort of product that you have to spend money to be able to access. But this book is available for free online at projectindefensible.org. And Danaka has put the link into the chat, so you can access that. And even though the site is a bit clunky, I have to say, it is quite possible to read the book online and to use it as a valuable resource. So in terms of the work that we do, if you'd ever want a screening of the Shadow World film, we would be delighted to organize that with Danaka and CODEPINK's help. If you want to follow our work on a sort of a daily basis, then probably the best way is through Twitter. Either just look for my handle, which is Andrew Feinstein as one word, or Shadow World Investigations. And you'll see the sort of stuff that we're doing on a daily basis as we live in this universe that is dominated by the arms trade. So the United States spends well over $1 trillion every year on its militarism. And that's a very conservative estimate. And that excludes the spending of the intelligence agencies and a number of other arms of state that you could actually, in my opinion, you could include in what I would call national security spending. I think to call it defense spending is taking George Orwell's notion of doublespeak to an extreme. There's nothing defensive about it. And that's one of the myths that I think we need to deal with. And to sustain that level of spending, a Pentagon budget that is always in excess of $700 billion a year, you then include the costs of actual conflicts. And of course, the United States is engaged in more conflicts around the world than any other nation on the planet. And we should never forget that fact. Takes it well over $1 trillion a year. Now, the first question is the spending justified? Does the spending make us more secure? Well, the only justification for the spending is that it circulates obscene amounts of money around what Colin Powell's former chief of staff, retired Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, describes as the global national security elite. And this is very senior politicians, and we're talking here White House 10 Downing Street seniority, senior military leaders, senior state officials outside of the Pentagon, in this instance, the senior executives at the largest defense contractors, and a group of sorted intermediaries used to be referred to as, so these are what we call in our work either arms dealers, arms agents, or brokers, depending on the function that they perform. But more importantly than these sort of people who Hollywood films depict at these sort of criminal lowlives, whereas in fact, most of them are members of this elite. They probably, the clothes that they wear on any given day are worth more than most of us are as individuals. They include lobbyists, obviously, but these are the people who really put the deals together and most importantly, facilitate the corruption that is endemic to almost every large arms deal that takes place in the world. And in addition to those people, you then have the more formal institutional intermediaries who include the world's largest banks and some of the smaller ones, law firms, auditing practices, and various types of consultancies. So most of the big consulting firms will be involved in the world's large arms deals. Often they're simply involved in facilitating and enabling the bribe payments. And the reason I mention this is because I think it is absolutely crucial to understand that what underpins the global trade in weapons is this economy. Exactly, as Fahim has said, the self-licking ice cream cone, as I think it was Chuck Spinney, who was a Pentagon whistleblower, who originally coined that phrase. And it's the perfect one. Because what is important is to understand that the trade in weapons is the most corrupt of all trades. It accounts for around 40% of all corruption in all world trade. And the assumption is, okay, so when the US does a multi-billion-dollar deal with Saudi Arabia, all sorts of members of the royal family get massive bribes. And those bribes are often in the billions themselves. And that is true. And the Saudis actually use these massive arms deals as a mechanism for moving money from the state treasury into their private offshore bank accounts, usually in offshore jurisdictions around the world. But there is another element to it that is absolutely crucial to our understanding of this trade. And that is what Pierre Spray, who very sadly passed away just a few months ago, another former Pentagon whistleblower and a remarkable man, both Chuck and Pierre appear in the Shadow World film. Pierre describes it as the feedback principle. So when these massive bribes are paid, it's not only the recipients, the buyers who get bribed, some of those bribes return to the selling country, to the politicians who are absolutely central to these deals, to the diplomats who are crucial to these deals, to the military leaders who are required in these deals, and to various others who play a part. So as Pierce says, in a very evocative way, he says, initially some of these people go into these companies thinking they want to run a good company. And by the way, no defense contractor is a good company. They would all be out of business if it wasn't for their government subsidies. Not one of them would make a profit. Lockheed Martin once tried to make tractors. They literally couldn't give them away. They were so bad. They're rubbish at what they do. The only thing that they're good at doing is paying bribes and extorting money from the state. But as Pierre says, they start off actually wanting to run a good company, and then they get involved in their first deal. And they realize that the feedback from the bribe that they receive personally is exponentially more than the salary and bonus that they're going to earn in the next year. And they're earning a lot of money. I mean, we're talking millions here that they're earning, but the feedback from the bribes is so much more than that. So, they realize, well, rather than traveling the world, pursuing new deals, what they're actually doing is traveling the world trying to identify people to bribe. Because that's how both they personally and their companies make the most amount of money. And unfortunately, that lies at the heartbeat of the global trade in weapons. But of course we hear this trade does two things. First of all, it's great for our economy. Now, the reality is there have been a number of studies, all of which you can see in Indefensible, that across the board, and I have multiple degrees in economics because I'm of a generation that had to study endlessly to avoid serving in the apartheid military in South Africa, where I grew up. There are 3 comprehensive, economically incredibly rigorous studies that we refer to in Indefensible that show on average, and I am aggregating here, that for every dollar of public money invested into one job in the defense sector, you could, with that dollar, create between 3 and 7 equivalent jobs in far more socially and economically efficient sectors. The most obvious of which is renewable energy, but there are all sorts of others. So from a jobs perspective, as brilliant work by Frida Berrigan has indicated, the defense sector is an appalling way to create jobs. From a GDP perspective, there are only 2 countries who actually benefit in GDP terms from their defense sectors: the United States to a small extent, and Israel to a larger extent. Israel is effectively the research and development arm of the United States arms trade, to put it bluntly and fundamentally. Outside of that, defense sectors generally actually have a negative impact on GDP. And I experienced that in South Africa, where my own government, the ANC, just after Nelson Mandela retired from office, decided to spend $10 billion on weapons. We didn't need the weapons. We've barely used the weapons we bought. And the only reason that we bought the weapons was because $350 million of bribes were paid to many senior politicians, military leaders, intermediaries, and very sadly to my own party, the ANC itself. We were told that this was going to grow our economy. On an annual basis over the next 20 years, and we're still paying off the deal, it has cut approximately between 1.7 and 1.93% of South Africa's gross domestic product every year. Economically, the defense sector is a disaster zone. But, of course, it's making us safer. No, it's not. It is not, partly because of how it is constructed and designed, and partly because it isn't intended to make us safer. So what do I mean by that? Well, firstly, let me give you an example. Again, you can find it in Indefensible. After the tragedy of 9/11, which some would describe as blowback for America's support to, amongst others, the Mujahideen in Afghanistan when they were fighting the Soviet Union, which occupied Afghanistan at that point. But that's a whole nother issue we can get into. After the tragedy of 9/11, an assessment was done of US national security. And the one area that was seen to be insecure, if you will, was the Coast Guard. So a contract worth $11 billion was given to a company I'm sure none of you have ever heard of, called Lockheed Martin, which happens to be the largest defense contractor on the planet. And in my opinion, probably the worst run company on the planet, and always has been. It's been a fine tradition that it has maintained over many decades. Over the next 10 years, for that $11 billion, and this is based on some brilliant work by a writer all of you in the US should follow, called Bill Hartung. Lockheed Martin produced one vessel. And when that vessel was launched into water, its hull cracked. That was the extent of what $11 billion did to improve the American Coast Guard in that 10-year period after 9/11. So you would think in any functioning democracy, and I'm going to leave it to you to decide whether the US, what Greg Palast describes as the best democracy money can buy, is in fact a functioning democracy. But as you would expect in a functioning democracy, that would lead to consequences. Well, the consequences were that Lockheed Martin were given an additional $10 billion. And that rather than providing oversight and accountability for the project themselves, the oversight of the project was given to another defense contractor. So the government wasn't even concerned enough to provide oversight for the now over $20 billion that Lockheed Martin was getting. So that's just basically the complete inefficiency, incompetence, and corrupt nature of defense contractors means that they tend not to make us more secure. But then there's a far more fundamental way. What has to be done to maintain these ridiculous levels of defense spending is that we all have to live in fear. And that's another thing I have to admit the defense contractors with enormous help from our government are very good at, is inculcating fear. And I have to say, with a lot of help from Hollywood. And what is that fear about? Well, to give you an example of how it manifests, in a study that again is indefensible, it was conducted in, and I'm open to correction here, either 2016 or 2017. Almost 40% of all adult Americans were convinced that a member of their direct family, so their immediate small family, would be killed in a terrorist attack within the next 12 months. Now, the reality is that yourself or a member of your immediate family was far more likely to be killed by a toddler under the age of 6 in your own home with your own gun than you were to be killed in a terrorist attack. That is the factual reality. But through the war on terror, we created this enormous sense of fear, a sense of fear that resulted in out of control Islamophobia and racism across what is sometimes described as the Western world, primarily the United States, the United Kingdom, and Western Europe. But while creating this sense of fear, our government was selling more and more weapons to the main ideological supporter of, financier of, and weaponizer of the most extreme form of what our government describes as Islamist terrorism. And I use all of these terms with great caution, because my former boss, Nelson Mandela, who is one of the very few politicians that I've ever had contact with, who actually has integrity, who was actually interested in more than personal power or holding on to that power. Nelson Mandela was described as a terrorist by Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, who tried to persuade the South African government to execute him because they thought it was too dangerous to keep him alive in prison. Now, the country that is the greatest supporter of the most extreme form of Islam, Wahhabism, is the government of Saudi Arabia, to whom the United States of America and the so-called Western world sell more weapons than anywhere else, who are our closest allies, bar Israel, in the Middle East. But in addition to their championing of Wahhabism, Saudi Arabia, as said by, amongst others, Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden, who I believe is a fairly prominent politician in the United States of America, who've both admitted that Saudi Arabia has, on numerous occasions, armed the very groups that we are supposedly engaged in an endless and continuous war on terror, or whatever it gets renamed to be every few years. So the absurdity of the situation is that a few years ago, I was sitting in an open meeting in Washington, DC, and somebody asked the question. It turned out he was a member of the Defense Intelligence Agency, the DIA, and he said, how are Houthi militias in Yemen having access to American weapons? And nobody could answer him. So me, being the little guy from Cape Town in South Africa, put up my hand and said, well, it's actually fairly obvious. America sold these weapons to Saudi Arabia, who gave them for free to a group in Syria that America briefly thought was on our side in the conflict in Syria. Those weapons then traveled via Oman, which acts as a sort of a conduit for all sorts of weapons in the Middle East, to the same group of people who are fighting with the Houthi militias in Yemen. But how on earth am I telling you that when you are supposed to be the Defense Intelligence Agency of the government that sold the weapons to Saudi Arabia, knowing they passed them on to all sorts of groups? Because there are absolutely no mechanisms to control what happens to weapons once we sell them. We do have the option of actually putting tracking on every bullet, every handgun, every piece of machinery, every weapon system that we create. But we have no interest in doing that. It's expensive. And then we'd know exactly who used our weapons, which would be very embarrassing publicly. Or we could conduct post-sale investigations. But then again, all that would do is give us information that would seriously embarrass us and who we sell to. Now, on the most corrupt commercial transaction in history, which happened to be an arms deal, where, because Ronald Reagan couldn't get it through Congress because of the Israel lobby in Congress at the time, Margaret Thatcher's Britain sold Saudi Arabia 43 billion pounds worth of weapons and paid 6 billion with a B, pounds of bribes. One of the people who received just over £1 billion of those bribes was a guy called Prince Bandar bin Sultan, who at the time was the Saudi ambassador to the United States of America, and whose father just happened to be the defense minister in Saudi Arabia at the time. Paid into Riggs Bank in Washington, DC, opposite the White House. This wasn't a clandestine operation. Some of that money went from Bandar's account into his wife's account at the same Riggs Bank and into the accounts of 2 of the 9/11 hijackers. So the relationship between Saudi Arabia and the threat that we have created for decades now is symbiotic. And this is the basis of our foreign policy in the most troubled and febrile region of the world, the Middle East. But let us think at one more level at which all of this spending is making us more secure. What are the real threats facing us today? I think anybody who has a couple of brain cells would probably think that the climate catastrophe and global health pandemics are probably fairly threatening, not just to us as individuals, but to us as humanity. And every dollar that is spent on what President Eisenhower described as the military-industrial congressional complex. The word congressional is often left out there. Every dollar that goes into the complex is a dollar less to support the real human security threats that we face and that our governments seem so inadequate in addressing. At the time that the British government could not provide sufficient masks and gloves for our frontline healthcare workers at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, we increased our defense budget by £17 billion. The United States of America could not produce ventilators for months into the pandemic, but passed a record defense budget as the pandemic struck. So it is this insane militarism that is actually stopping us meaningfully addressing the real security threats that we face. And which is the largest institutional polluter on the planet? You've guessed it, the Pentagon. So, two other very quick points, and then we'll get into some questions and some discussion. We're told that the only real corruption in this trade happens in the global south, out there, in these less civilized countries. Of course it doesn't, because of the feedback. Our own politicians are being funded in their campaigns by the defense contractors. They then go into their congressional committees and money goes back to those very same defense contractors. Our politicians are bought. The legislation is written for them by lobbyists for the defense contractors. And this is how money continues to circulate. And why do they choose the global arms trade to do this? Why not do it in the oil sector? Why not do it in pharmaceuticals? I'm not saying there's not money going into politics from those sectors, but it is in an extreme form in the arms trade. And the main reason for that is because every arms deal that takes place, anything that Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, Boeing, etc. do, takes place behind a veil or curtain of national security imposed secrecy. So that for investigative writers like myself, we've requested maybe 15,000 freedom of information requests around the world. We've got maybe one or two replies that haven't said, this is a matter of national security and the information can therefore not be disclosed to you. So that is why it is in this sector that so much political corruption takes place. So what can we do? Our politicians are not going to change a system that benefits them. It benefits them economically, both personally and politically, and it benefits them politically. They are the ones keeping us safe, when in reality, they're doing exactly the opposite. It is up to us, the taxpayer, the voter, to bring about change. And how do we do that? We do that by putting this information into the public domain, by ensuring that as many people as possible get access to this information, see the films that are now being made, get involved in the sort of work that CODEPINK are doing, that Veterans for Peace in the United States are doing. And amongst those campaigns, there's a brilliant campaign that Veterans for Peace are very involved in, which is about withholding 30% of what they pay in taxes to the federal government. Why? Because Bill Harting has calculated that 30 cents in every dollar of tax paid in the United States of America goes to the defense contractors. And if we want to live honest, integrous lives that are best for ourselves, our families, our neighbors, our country, and our world and planet, we need to start withholding that money. And finally, let me just say the following. For those who might be sitting here thinking, yeah, you know, corruption's a victimless crime. Does it actually hurt anyone? Let me give you an example outside of the wars and the conflict, outside of the tens of thousands of innocent Yemeni civilians. In my own case in South Africa, the deal that I mentioned to you. It took place at exactly the time that Mandela's successor, a man called Thabo Mbeki, was telling our country and the 6 million people in the country living with HIV or AIDS that we didn't have the resources to provide them with antiretroviral medication that would keep them alive. As a consequence of which, excuse me, a study, and a very conservative study at the Kennedy School of Government, concluded that over the next 5 years, that policy choice resulted in the avoidable deaths of 165,000 South Africans over 5 years, and the births of 32,000 HIV positive babies every year of those 5 years. Because we couldn't afford mother-to-child transmission treatment, but we could afford to spend $10 billion on weapons that we've never needed and have barely used. Let me leave it there.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I feel like we oftentimes don't take that time to really think about what we as people living on Earth sacrifice for the national security state and our Pentagon spending, and it's very topical. The Senate just passed an increased Pentagon budget, even though we have ended a 20-year intervention in Afghanistan. How does it make sense to expand the Pentagon budget, most of which goes to weapons, private companies like Lockheed Martin and Raytheon, Boeing, etc.? How does it make sense to expand the Pentagon budget? So it's really great that we're coming and taking time to think about that. But we do have some questions in the Q&A from Fahim. Why has the arms industry in the US never been a national entity as opposed to a private entity?
Sorry, you'd think after over 2 years I got used to unmuting myself, but I still managed to do it. That's actually a great question. Just to answer it very quickly. In many countries of Western Europe, the big defense manufacturers were always state-owned. From 1979, 1980, the so-called neoliberal revolution led by Thatcher and Reagan, where everything was deregulated and all sorts of things were privatized. I mean, America had been privatized before that, but in the UK and Europe, far less so. All of those companies started to be privatized. In the United States of America, they never organized weapons manufacturing as a state function. And I think that's partly to do with the way in which the United States came into being, with this sort of independence of the states and the nature of the federal system, first of all. I don't think anybody trusted each other enough for either the states themselves or the federal government to take control over the weapons business. And then I think it's part of the sort of extreme form of neoliberal capitalism that exists in the United States of America, where there is this completely erroneous notion, in my opinion, from an economics perspective, that the private sector does things so much better than the public sector. Of course, the greatest example of that in the United States of America was Ronald Reagan's Star Wars initiative. I'd had to leave South Africa in the mid-'80s and went to the University of California at Berkeley, which was still a vaguely left-wing place then. I'm not sure it is anymore. It certainly wasn't as it had been in the 60s. And I was given a Rotary International Scholarship. So I had to go and give a talk at the local Rotary Club. And I didn't realize what a Rotary Club was, and was a little bit shocked when I got there, because it appeared that all these very, very wealthy people had made their tens of millions, if not billions of dollars through Ronald Reagan's Star Wars program. And of course, the Star Wars, it was going to be a sort of a missile shield. It never ever worked, but the federal government invested tens of billions of dollars, if not hundreds of billions of dollars, into creating this thing that technologically everybody knew would never work.
Thank you, and thank you to Fahim for that wonderful question. Edwina is asking, I know we're talking more on the macro view, but what about the new Cold War weapons like hypersonic missiles, which is part of the increase in the arms sale businesses?
I think what we see in every generation of the weapons business, I've been doing this work for just over 20 years, but looking at it historically, one sees that there is a sort of a generational thing since the 1890s, since sort of the modern political economy, if you will. And what one sees is ever new forms of technology manifesting in weaponry. Whether it works or not is a completely different matter. And of course, now, we're looking at issues like cyber warfare. We're looking at the militarization of space. My own experience of this is that what the technology is touted to be about to deliver is never delivered. And that's exactly what defense contractors have done throughout their histories. They never deliver what they promise to deliver, first of all. Second of all, they often, when they make things more technologically advanced, they actually make them worse. So the best example is the F-35, which is the most expensive weapon system ever developed. It's cost you, the American taxpayer, almost $2 trillion now. I used to use the figure of $1.5 trillion, but I would imagine it's much closer to 2 trillion now than 1.5 trillion. And if you go back to the latest Inspector General's report on the F-35, which was released in, I think, February, maybe March of this year, Danaka, you might be able to correct me there. The Inspector General basically says, well, the brains of this jet fighter, what's sometimes called the combat suite, just doesn't work. They're going to have to start all over again at a cost of goodness knows how many hundreds of millions again. And the Inspector General tries to put a broad estimate on the sort of additional money that's going to be required now and the sorts of monies that have been expended. But they're very inaccurate estimates, but they're extortionate. Anyway, look at Bill Harting's work for the most up-to-date stuff on that. The reality is that the F-35, as the late Pierce Spray said, is $1 trillion turkey. The only good thing from an anti-militarist perspective about the F-35 is that the only people it's going to endanger are its test pilots, because it just keeps on failing test flights. When it was about to be launched in Europe at the Farnborough Air Show in Britain, it never made it because it caught fire on the runway at its Air Force base that it was leaving from in the United States of America. It's an embarrassment of a jet. Your former president, Donald Trump, of course, announced that the F-35 was actually invisible, that it, that you couldn't see it in the sky. He clearly didn't understand that it was supposed to be invisible on radar, but even that functionality of it has not worked particularly well. So what the technology does is it ramps up the price. And when the price gets ramped up, guess what else gets ramped up? The money flows to the politicians, to the military leaders, to everybody else involved. So the higher the tech can be, the better. Is it actually going to make a difference? No. Is it going to change the nature of warfare? To some extent, because we've already seen with drone warfare that it simply makes endangering Americans, or the mercenaries that the American military often uses in conflicts now. It reduces the dangers to those individuals, which is never a bad thing, but it also reduces the person actually pulling the trigger. It reduces their understanding of what they're actually doing, in the sense that they are more distanced from it, and in some instances find it easier to therefore morally distance themselves from the actions they're actually engaged in.
Yeah, it's just, I don't know if it's maybe funny at first and then frustrating that these companies get all of our money and then they're not even good at doing what they're supposed to do. A few weeks ago, I saw this video about a new aircraft carrier that the US has been building for like 10 years, obviously spending millions, maybe $1 billion on this aircraft carrier. And in the video, it was like, if the toilet on this aircraft carrier gets clogged, it costs $400,000 to unclog the toilet. And I was just laughing so hard at that, but also so frustrated. So that's what it makes me think of. But maybe we have time for a couple more questions. Okay, this is from Fahim. what is it about many average people that have a hard time buying the point that spending on military does not benefit anyone other than the 0.1%, especially the poor? How do you recommend that we engage with the average person on this issue? What's your elevator speech?
Another great question. I should, just before I answer that, mention someone asked, do the Saudis and the Emiratis actually use the jets that they buy, or do they get others to fly them for them? Just very quickly, when I was writing The Shadow World, so sort of late-ish 2011, I got hold of some photos of deserts of Saudi Arabia and counted at least 79 brand new jets that were simply sitting rusting in the deserts that had never ever been flown. Often they just buy them to cement political alliances and for the corruption, and don't intend to use them. The problem since Mohammed bin Salman has been in power as the crown prince, I personally, and 3 of my first degrees were in clinical psychology, believe that the man is a psychopath. And unfortunately, we're seeing that played out in terms of their foreign policy and the brutality of the war in Yemen and their interventions elsewhere. Most of their fighting is done by mercenaries. They do have a few pilots. They're not very good. But there's more to buying the equipment than using it. And I wish they'd use it even less now. Very quickly, in terms of Fahim's brilliant question, short answer, the media and Hollywood. Our media, which I believe are failing our countries around the world. Our media have become part of the political process and part of the beneficiaries of the political process. If you look at what most journalists earn, and you look at which companies own the big media houses now, first of all, there's a lot of overlapping ownership with defense contractors. Second of all, their interests are all very closely aligned. So there's no traditional media that talks with any honesty about the reality of US militarism or the US arms trade. And I think as a consequence, it's incredibly difficult for ordinary citizens to actually be informed on these issues. And that makes our role as campaigners so much more important. And that's why we produced Indefensible. It's why we made the film, and there's more coming. We do a lot of stuff on social media. There's a great little short 7-minute film, which is going to be the first of 7, by a group called Demilitarize Education. You can find them on Twitter and on WhatsApp. They're very good on WhatsApp, which I can't figure out. Not WhatsApp, Instagram, which I can't figure out. I can't post anything on Instagram, it just doesn't work for me. But if you look for Demilitarize Education, they've got a brilliant 7-minute video exactly on this topic, the 7 myths. It's based on the book, the 7 myths and show that to people. And then show them the other 6 videos that are still to come. The elevator speech is every single dollar that is spent on the F-35 is making you less safe because it's not being spent on the climate catastrophe or on COVID-19. And the F-35 doesn't work, so it's not making you safer, and it is taking food off your table. Dwight D. Eisenhower, Republican president, former military general, is the best person to quote to ordinary Americans. He not only said that we must beware the power of the military-industrial complex, as he was persuaded to call it in the speech, leaving out the word congressional, but he also spoke about how for every gun, there is less butter on the table of ordinary Americans. And of course, Martin Luther King Jr. spoke extensively about US militarism, but we never hear about that. We only hear about his deep commitment to racial equality. But we should hear the full oeuvre of his politics, which included a very strong and a very coherent and intelligent anti-militarism. And it's why it's so great to see in a few of the more progressive members of Congress who've emerged in recent years, who interestingly mostly tend to be women, for the first time, we are seeing a quite coherent and smart anti-militarism. And I think CODEPINK is in some ways partly responsible for that.
Thank you. I put the link to the video Andrew mentioned in the chat from Demilitarize Education. That video is actually one I played when I was starting a local campaign in my district to get my representative, Mike Quigley, to stop taking money from weapons companies. It takes about $40K an election cycle from the top 5 weapons manufacturers, and it amped people up. So if you need a 7-minute video to send someone, I really, really do recommend it. They're very, very smart group of people making those videos. So I'm excited for the rest that will come out. Just to give you all sort of an idea of how fun these campaigns can be to run, to pressure your rep to stop taking money from weapons companies, we were outside of our congressman's office dressed like hot dogs because we're from Chicago. Chicago loves hot dogs and not Lockheed Martin. So it's a very good time. We're trying to get as many members of Congress to sign the pledge to stop taking campaign contributions from weapons companies as possible. So please join our campaign. You can go to codepink.org/call to disarm. And I want to thank again Andrew Feinstein for joining us today. This was so great. And if you want to share this with anyone, it's going to be up on YouTube and it's up on Twitter right now, both at CODEPINK. Both usernames are just CODEPINK, so you could find them there. And Andrew, do you have any last thoughts for us?
Yeah, there was a great, I'm first of all, sorry we didn't get through all of the questions, but please feel free to be in touch. If you look at our website, shadowworldinvestigations.org, you can just ping me and my colleagues an email on there. We'll always reply to you, even if it's not the next day. If you have any other questions or just want to start a dialogue with us, please feel free to do that. And I hope when we are through the pandemic, to be spending some time in the US again, to be showing the film more, to be working again more directly with CODEPINK on the ground. But just to say, there was a very interesting American anthropologist by the name of Margaret Mead, who, when she was 15, her father started telling her that she needed to leave school, help her mother more in the kitchen, and in a year or so needed to start looking for a husband. So her response to that was to become the first woman to be awarded a PhD by Harvard University. And she had an extraordinary career in which she ventured into the Amazon and lived among people who we in the so-called West described as uncivilized. And she argued that they were in fact in many ways far more civilized than we could ever hope to be. And at the end of her life, she said, never forget that history is changed by the actions of small groups of thoughtful, committed citizens working together. It has always been the case, and it always will be. So when we think about what needs to be done, let's look in the mirror and say to ourselves, let's think about what we're going to do to change history and to change the world we live in.
Thank you. That was so motivating, and hopefully everyone takes action here, joins CODEPINK, joins any org working against military spending, the Pentagon, and militarism in general. And thank you to Andrew again for joining us today. I hope everyone has a beautiful rest of their evening, morning, wherever you may be.